but he's also a best-selling author, having written The Next Decade and The Next 100 Years, which at the time of their publications, many thought had some outlandish propositions in them. And yet, as reality plays out on the ground, many are arguing that he's been quite prescient after all. He's talked about, and we'll get into this, the decline of the European Union, the moderate isolationism that could come in the United States, the confrontation that would come between Russia and the West, and a particularly interesting role for Central Europe in this dynamic going forward. I think you termed it a second Cold War, and specifically said that by the mid-2010s, we could expect to see Russian troops back on the Polish border. This is an author, this is an analyst, this is someone who was actually born in this region, born in Budapest, to Holocaust survivors. His family fled communism, whose mother was born here in Bratislava. His roots are deep in this region. And so with this brief introduction, I want to turn to you, and basically you set out a proposition that we would be entering a second Cold War, that we would be facing a confrontation between Russia and the West. Offer for us how this became part of your forecasting, your analysis.
Well, a number of things became clear, showing me that the post-Cold War world was, as all periods are, temporary. Three things happened. The first, the American withdrawal from the jihadist wars, reshaping American global strategy. Second, the massive divergence within the European Union, in which Southern Europe is suffering a social catastrophe of the first order, whereas the North is doing fairly well, creating tensions, divisions, and indecision within Europe. And finally, the third pillar of the post-Cold War world, China, returning to a more normal and sustainable growth rate than it had before. Under these circumstances, Russia had a window of opportunity opened to itself. The 1990s in Russia were an aberration. It was not a normal condition. It was firstly another social catastrophe underway. It was also a period in which, as Vladimir Putin put it, there was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, well, at least for for Russia and the Soviet Union. During this time, Russia had an opportunity in the 2010s to rebuild its power in some significant ways, not overwhelmingly, but certainly relative to Europe, relative to the United States at the moment. And Russia also had two massive problems. The Soviet Union and the Russian Empire existed in the form it did for certain good reasons that we now see in Ukrainian wheat, weapons that are produced in the Ukraine that the Russia needs. There is an integration there that's very real. But more important than that, Russia has survived its long history by depth. Napoleon was destroyed by depth. Hitler was destroyed by depth. And Russia had that depth because it held at least Belarus and Ukraine. And because of that, Hitler was exhausted by the time he got to Stalingrad. Because of the depth, he didn't make it to Moscow. Depth is an essential characteristic of Russian strategy. The apparent loss of Ukraine was a catastrophe for Russia. The idea that Ukraine might become integrated into Western institutions, Europe, NATO, posed a threat to Russian viability that no Russian leader could easily countenance. He still hasn't done that. He has somehow taken a strategic disaster, the loss of a pro-Russian government, sort of, in Ukraine. It's replaced it by a pro-Western government, sort of, and has turned that into an apparent aggressive foreign policy in Crimea, which he had already held, and by nibbling around its cities in the east. I'm not belittling what he's doing. I'm simply saying that if Ukraine joins the Western alliance system, and you look at a map, Russia is in the kind of strategic position it hasn't been for a very long time. Now, its great fortune is that Europe is absolutely divided, weak, and indecisive. The United States is doing what it does best, mulling its options. And he has a clear field for the short period of time, of perhaps a year or two, in which he can try to solidify the security of Russia.
So let me pick up on, I kind of want to pick up on your themes around the role of Europe, the role of the United States, Russia, and then this region. So let's start with Europe. I mean, you've been fairly dismissive of the European Union, this great project, this post-Westphalian future that the EU was meant to bring about. Lay out your analysis about how you see Europe and the European Union playing in this particular crisis, what it means for the long term.
Well, the first thing to always remember about Europe is that Germany exports the equivalent of about 40% of its GDP every year, half of it going to Europe. This creates massive development problems in the weaker countries, particularly in the South, especially those who've also entered into the Eurozone. Unemployment in the South is 26% in Greece, 26% in Spain, 16% in Portugal, and in southern Italy and southern France, in the area of 20%. This is a catastrophic situation. Northern Europe is in a somewhat better position. So when I speak of the European Union, I have trouble speaking of it as one entity because the reality of the various parts of the European Union, including now what we used to call Eastern Europe, which faces Russia, uncertain of what support it has behind it, because after all, the European Union is not a military alliance, there's only NATO, and NATO is unclear in what it will do. I can no longer think of Europe as one place. I can think of Germany, I can think of France, I can think of Spain, but I have trouble seeing a united Europe in any sense that's going in the same direction or wants to.
Let me turn then on the other side of the equation on Russia. You've written that Russia will not become a global power in the next decade, but it actually has no choice but to become a major regional power. And that means that it will clash with Europe. The Russian-European frontier remains a fault line. So that challenges the presumption of the post-Cold War, this vision of a Europe whole and free in which Russia would actually find its peaceful, rightful place, if you will, a European Russia. Are you saying that that vision wasn't a realistic approach from the very beginning by definition, or what derailed this?
Well, I mean, first, in the 1990s, you did not have constitutional democracy. You had unplanned chaos looking as liberalization. Later, there had to be a rectification. Any Russian leader looking at the condition of Russia in 1999 would have had to do something, and do something as decisive as possible, without the institutions of liberal democracy, which didn't exist. There's always been a profound difference in the culture of Russia and of the European peninsula. And I would put it in the way Thucydides put it. Russia is a landlocked power, without Belarus and Ukraine and so on. It is a place that is poor, but like Sparta, strong. The European peninsula is prosperous through maritime trade. In the European peninsula, nothing is farther than 400 miles from the sea. It is luxurious, comfortable, and inherently weak, as Thucydides described Athens and Sparta. These two places run by a different clock, by different needs. The expectations of the Russians are different from the expectations of the French or the Germans, economically, and what choices are there. These are very different places. They share Christianity in a way, and not all that often. But beyond that, they're very different places. And Russia is very hard to defend. East of the Carpathians, in the North European plain, the armies can come regularly and cause havoc. The Russians want to push as far west as they can to have as much room to anchor themselves as well as possible to protect the country. They have many historical precedents of why they need to do this. The Europeans obviously want to hold the Poles, who are in their face, the Romanians, who are potentially in their face, want to hold as far as they can. And so there is a friction point, a flash point at this border.
So you've made the case for strategic depth being one of the compelling rationale here. Last night in the Night Owl, for those of you who were here for the conversation on Russia at the time, there were several folks that put an emphasis on civilizational lines. Russian Mir, the Russian world, whether this is ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, or even Slavic, Orthodox. And so therefore, where does that actually line fall? Is this just the geopolitical reality of strategic depth, or is there a civilizational aspect to what's playing out?
Well, civilization, ever since Huntington got through with it, became such a dynamic concept that I don't know what quite to say about it. They're certainly different. Are they a separate, different civilization? I'm not sure. But I would most look at Guderian driving on the North European plain toward Moscow, and the great panic in Moscow when he appeared that he would reach that. And to understand that if you are a reasonable Russian, you were very complacent in 1932 that Germany, a wreck, economically inefficient, with no army, was never a danger. And then in 1938, it was the biggest power in Europe. Two things the Russians know that I think is more important than civilization. Things change very fast.
So in some respects, you're talking about the inevitability of this. While I think many folks that I've heard in the debate over the past 24 hours are really making a distinction between Putin and Russia. That doesn't necessarily hold in your analysis, or help us understand. What are we seeing today in Ukraine as a result of a leader like Putin versus the result of any Russian leader?
The Russian Empire existed since the 18th century. It had a general form. For a while during the Russian Revolution, it broke apart and then resumed its old form. It broke apart in the 1990s, going to a different structure. The first thing we have to understand is the forms of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union were not accidental. They had a kind of logic. But secondly, to make it much simpler, if you lived in Russia in the 1990s, if you weren't paid as a teacher for 6 months or a year, if the rule of law had completely collapsed and you were being told that this was liberal democracy unwinding itself, what would your response be? You would want some order. You would want your paycheck. You would want someone, however much they were stealing, to give you your life back. And if you were a Russian leader and you looked west, you would see the West poking away at your various former colonies, integrating the Baltics into NATO, when you think at least that you heard them say that they would never do any such thing. And you would say, how far will they go? So you have two different understandings, not two cultures. There's one culture which says catastrophe can come at any moment, and it can come in any form. And as a leader, I must protect against it. And other culture that was saying there are no more catastrophes. All our intentions are the best. We have no idea why you're uneasy with us. And there was this divergence between a belief that history had been suspended in Europe and the belief by the Russians that this was just an interregnum before the next national disaster. And so they looked for the space. And so when, on a Sunday a few months ago now, a pro-Western government appeared to be coming into place in a region that is absolutely vital in your mind to your national security, your response was going to be unpleasant, to say the least.
So let me just drill down a little bit further on Russia, then I'll move back to this region. I think if I'm right, I think you essentially suggested, anticipated some type of a second Cold War about now. But it looked further into the future in the next decade, in the 2020s, a more drastic sort of fragmentation, actually dissolution of Russia, a collapse of the central authority in Moscow, I think is what you called for in one of your books. Is that the trajectory that you see the
Yes.
events moving?
Russia is temporarily strong only because everyone around it is weak. But the weakness of Europe and the weakness of the United States is not inherent. It is simply a choice at the moment. In the meantime, the foundation of Russian national power is extremely fragile. It truly, when you look at it very carefully, depends on the price of oil. But we don't know what the price of oil is going to be, except that the United States has revolutionized oil production, except that China's demand for oil has declined. To base your national security ultimately not merely on geography, but on the availability of a commodity at a certain price is very dangerous. There was a reason the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and that was the essential non-functionality of its economic life, and the fact that the empire was draining the blood out of Russia itself as they financed and underwrote the various countries. That weakness is not gone. The only reason Russia appears to be strong, as I said, is because everybody else is so weak and indecisive and not willing to do anything. Well, truly, the Russians haven't done anything yet, so as excited as we get, do we have to do anything now or not? That becomes a very important question. But I don't see how, one, the Russians do not continue being aggressive. Two, the United States, certainly, and some countries of Europe won't respond. And I don't see how Russia withstands that response in the long run. So Marx once said that history repeats itself twice. The first time is tragedy, and the second time is farce. And we are seeing the second act of the Russian dissolution take place, which will be much easier and sadder than the first.
Does this mean Ukraine is a casualty in the coming year? What's the next?
Ukraine, Belarus, I suspect the Baltics and the Caucasus are all the battlegrounds, what I'll call the petty Cold War. It is not the Cold War. It is not Russian surrogates operating in Vietnam, ranging in Cuba. This is a much smaller regional thing, but it's still a desperate battle. A place like Georgia is of vital importance to the Russians, because if Azerbaijani oil pours through Georgia, that's an alternative. The Baltics are 90 miles from St. Petersburg. As I like to put it, NATO was once 1,000 miles from St. Petersburg. It is now 90 miles from St. Petersburg. The Russians are frightened of it and have tools for destabilizing the region. And of course the Ukraine is going to be an ongoing battleground, and I suspect Belarus. And the outcome, I think, is as foreordained as in the first case. The process will be as frightening as it was during the first.
So I want to bring in the audience shortly, but I want to come back first to this region of Central Europe. Interestingly, I think for our audience, you put quite a bit of emphasis on Central Europe as actually a major power well into the future. The Pilsudski idea of a Polish-led bloc, I think you call it the Polish bloc. And this morning, in many respects, we had the prime ministers of the Visegrad Four on stage, at least symbolically representing increasing regional cooperation in the region. Yet as we got into this discussion, some fairly obvious cleavages began to develop. How do you see what's happening now, either reinforcing your concept that Central Europe will become a power, will become a Polish-led power well into the future?
Well, to begin at the moment, Visegrad is trying to slap itself in the face, wake up, and realize that it wasn't a joke. When they founded Visegrad and had all the plans of a battle group and everything, no one ever thought it would happen. It was just something, that we'd talk about. The realization that there is possibly a reason to have a Visegrad battle group is now dawning, and it dawns at different rates on everybody. The Poles were much more serious about this from the beginning than the others. The Slovaks are not sure that they add anything to anything. The Hungarians are Hungarian, so they're going to try to make a deal with everyone, then double-cross everyone. This is our region. This is, what we do. The Czechs think they're Germans, and so when we take a look at the situation that we're in a transitional period. To me, what is so striking is the degree of obsession with what was really so minor an event. A president was deposed, some cities in eastern Russia had a fire and some people shot. And so far, nothing has happened. But we all know something will. And that's what's really important about certain historic moments. That well before anything has happened, the entire place holds its breath, knowing that it will. And so Visegrad sits down and says, so, now what do we do? It shouldn't be surprising that it's many different thoughts. I'm very pessimistic on the future of Germany, both for demographic reasons, its enormous dependence on exports, which means that its entire existence depends on their customers, and if their customers can't buy, they can be crushed. Export-oriented powers like China are devastated by the recessions in other countries. France is, of course, France. And when I look at the way Poland behaved during the economic crisis that we went through, I was startled by its robustness and its ability to manage. Startled but not surprised in a way, because I had said this would happen, but I didn't think it would happen this quickly. Poland is also emerging as a leader in this entire crisis, where Germany has decided that its oil exports or imports are more important than anything else, and the United States is making pronouncements that no one can understand. The Poles have tried to take a very reasoned and decisive position. They've behaved like a significant power. When I was there just a few years ago, I made a speech where I said the only thing that Poland lacks is self-confidence. You know, even I believe more in you than you believe in you. And they laughed. And now take a look at them. I mean, we have a very serious attempt by the Poles to shape the region. That it will be hard to do, that it'll be difficult. Still, we've entered a new historical moment.
So, George, I think this is a terrific moment to turn to the audience, because as you were speaking, I saw raised eyebrows of either a slight offense or skepticism coming from a Ukrainian, someone from the Baltic states, a Hungarian, a Czech, a German, at different moments in your discourse.
Is
right
there an
there.
Italian here I can
So
insult?
I think it's a great time to throw it open to the audience, and not from the poll. I was watching you, and I saw stoic face. But with that, I saw James share first. I'm going to start. If we could have a mic down, please state your name, ask a quick question. We've been given authorization to run over to about just over beyond 5:15, given we started late. So we'll start here, and then I'll pick up a couple of questions back to back if that works for you, George. James, please, you kick us off.
That way I can avoid the questions that I want to.
Damon, you stated my name. One brief comment and an equally brief question. The brief comment is that the distinguishing feature of the Russian view of geopolitics, Geopolitica, and the academic discipline of it, is that it incorporates the cultural and civilizational aspect in as deterministic a way as the Western conception incorporates the geographic aspect. My question is this. I'll just start by saying I fully agree with your understanding of the 1990s and your verdict, which has been mine, that what we hoped and expected from Russia in the 1990s in this vision was never possible. But the question I want to pose is how you comment on the proposition that Russia's real security dilemma, in large part, is caused by the fact that its conduct greatly aggravates and magnifies every reasonable security apprehension it has. As a case in point, NATO membership today is vastly more popular in Ukraine than it was when Viktor Yushchenko was in power. But all these examples could be multiplied over 20 years, and yet nobody seems to be drawing lessons from it in Moscow. And I apologize for my voice. Thank you.
He's been debating. You want to grab that quickly, because I've got lots of hands. I'll come to this gentleman.
The
in a second.
tragedy of the situation is that the Russians can't help but irritate everybody around them, any more than anybody around them can irritate the Russians. It is not simply bad humor, although they may have it, nor the virtue of the West, which may well be there. Each side is reasonably afraid of the other, because each side has every reason to be afraid of each other. And therefore, every time someone acts, however modestly, everyone overreacts. And one could say, well, let's all calm down and be reasonable people, to which I say, by all means. But it's not going to happen, because we're all afraid of something that's very real. We're not inventing it.
Please, sir.
My name is Federico Petroni. I am contributing editor at Limes, a review of geopolitics in Italy.
We have an Italian.
Yeah.
I didn't insult you.
And I would like to ask to pinpoint one issue that looms large here at Globsec 2014, but hasn't been tackled so far. And it's the role of the US in this region, the European Peninsula, as you said, and the role of NATO. This morning, there has been the Secretary of NATO claiming for a much more powerful NATO as far as the new conventional threats are concerned. But nobody has taken into account that the US has to pay for those increase of capabilities. And I would like you to comment on that.
I'd like to comment two ways. Firstly, historically, the United States has proceeded in a very particular way. We come in late and we come in hard. In World War I, we came in 3 weeks after the Tsar abdicated, and then over 1 million men came in. In World War II, our real activity was not until 1944 and the invasion of northern France. In the Cold War, the primary responsibility for defense of Germany was the Bundeswehrs. There were American troops there, but the promise was that war would come. We operate within two contexts. First, let those most exposed take the greatest risk and spend the greatest treasure. And secondly, wait until the last minute because maybe they don't need us. The United States has historically, in its major wars, not idiocies like Iraq, in its major wars, has consistently operated in an alliance structure. But there's a huge understanding, particularly in Eastern Europe, about the alliance structure. When we say alliance structure, we means you will be spending huge amounts of money, drafting your young men, and manning the Eastern Front. And we will join you. When the Europeans speak of it, they expect the Americans to write a check, send my children here, and be ready to absorb it. The step right now that I think the United States wants to see is the Visegrad Group take the painful steps, the politically unpopular steps, the strategically necessary steps. The expectation that the United States, as you said, is going to pay for this is not going to be the case. There will be certainly things you can't pay for, but you will pay for everything you can. And this is now the strategic decision that the Visegrad prime ministers have to make, and I think you heard from the Hungarians that they're not ready to make it yet. So we are not deep into this war, we're not even at the edge. We are, however, at the point where the Eastern Europeans have to make the decision how much risk can they stand and how much will they defend themselves.
So the Americans will be here late and heavy, so we've got a rough, bumpy time. Let me pick up Polish and American questions in this corner.
Michał Baranowski, GMF Warsaw. I actually want to ask a question not from a Polish perspective.
Sorry
do you
to
see
pigeonhole you,
this,
Michał.
but Poland is clearly a player here. Do you see this as a regional conflict between Europe, European Peninsula, and Russia, or do you see this as a beginning of a larger challenge to the West from not only Russia, but also others?
No,
If you want to go ahead, that's fine.
I
That's
would
fine.
say
We'll
that
go to
this
work.
is an ongoing struggle on the borderland between Russia and the peninsular powers, be they the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns or whatever. This has been going on for a very long time. 20 years ago, we announced it's over, it'll never come back, we're finished, thank God. We can now spend all of our time buying bonds. It's back. So I don't see it spreading into a struggle between the West and Russia. It is a struggle between the European Peninsula and Russia. It has been going on for a very long time. I think the Swedes started it, and it continues.
All right, Wes, please.
Dr. Friedman, Wes Mitchell from SEPA. I am fascinated in your analysis by the interplay between geography and human agency. And looking particularly at Central Europe, you wrote in a Stratfor analysis at one point that the Carpathian Mountains were the Achilles heel of the Visegrad Group because Poland to the north has a higher threat perception than the countries to the south. And I think that's exactly what was on display earlier today with the Visegrad 4 prime ministers on this panel. My question to you is, in what do you ground your confidence that this geographic flaw of Visegrad will be overcome at some point by human agency? At what point do the Hungarians and Slovaks and Czechs feel a sense of risk that's sufficient to lead them to make sacrifices to be part of a congealed military alliance? And in light of the interwar experience in this region, where geography, ultimately, the Carpathians did trump any sort of effective military cooperation, what would you ground your confidence in for our time?
Romania. And by that I mean, if you are interested in what Poland does, watch Romania a little bit, particularly in this crisis. It has behaved in a very unexpected way. It has become very aggressive in Moldova. It has done things like close airspace that you don't expect it to. The great Eastern Front powers are Romania and Poland in terms of population, size, everything else. Hungary, Slovakia, sandwiched in between these two, tend to be carried off by the pressure that builds up. To me, the most important conversations that are going on are those between the Polish leadership and the Romanian leadership. And I believe that both of them see the same thing. They see the Carpathians as a trap for them in a way, and the Poles see the Northern European plain as a nightmare. So, if I'm right, and I may not be, look to Romania, look to Poland. See them working together, and don't pay too much attention to Poland, and pay all the attention in the world to Slovakia, because that will be very important.
All right, we'll go north, and then I'll pick up Andrew.
Andris Spruce, Latvian Institute of International Affairs. So the Baltics. You mentioned the Baltics, NATO, and of course the NATO enlargement for the Baltics has been perceived as stability, security, the peace, and not only to the Baltic countries themselves, but also to the region. But in your book, Next Decade, enjoy reading, you mentioned the Baltics actually indefensible and a liability. Would you still say that Baltics are a liability, and should they be sacrificed by the West, by the NATO?
I don't think it should be sacrificed by NATO, but it also should be understood that as a bayonet, and that if the Russians wished either through internal destabilization or direct attack, it is a very difficult terrain to defend. It is now a NATO ally, and therefore we have to defend it, but who will do that? So when I'm a very tiresome man because I constantly ask questions like who's going to do the defending and who's going to do it, and NATO loves to have documents that don't address that question but guarantee things. So from my point of view, the problem of the Baltics is that it is a long bayonet extending, threatening the Russians without giving a defensive position of its own. So if I'm the Russians and I look at this and I say, nothing good will come of this to me. And if I'm the Americans, I say, this is not where I'm going to do my last stand. I did that at the Alamo. It is simply a problem. Now, if this all goes away, of course, the Baltics have no issue. But I think the Baltics are going to have an issue, as tragic as that may sound. But Baltic history is tragic.
Sounds like it's advice to a Latvian to make the presence permanent in the Baltic states. Ginnick, and then we'll pick up Andrew.
Friedman,
I've got quite a few more questions, so I'm going to ask people to be tight.
The leadership position which you have mentioned, which you upgrade to Poland, depends very much on others who would be willing to cooperate, and this element is missing. The same in the case of Romania. In terms of talks, this is happening, but in terms of capabilities, or what you are willing to put on the table, this element is missing as well. In many, the question which I would like to ask you is, and I enjoy reading your analysis. so refreshing. But you talk about a strategic depth, which I perfectly understand in Russian. But isn't it a thing of the past? In the times of drones, planes, and missiles, if you do not want to occupy a territory, and this is the thing of the past, unless you do it for political reasons, isn't it a kind of a phantom pain from the past which doesn't relate to the military and strategic realities of the day?
Yes.
Particularly because you're known for putting an emphasis on the change in technology in your work.
I do believe in that, and because of this technology, the United States defeated Iraq. It didn't defeat Iraq. The thing that we learned in Iraq, and this was counterinsurgency, was that conventional military calculus still matters. And it matters for a very simple reason. There are many targets and very few drones and missiles. The Air Force, my son is in the Air Force and assures me this will be true next time, has been promising us since World War II that we do not have to invade, we will bomb them and they will capitulate. Goering promised that. It was promised in Vietnam that we do not have to fight, we will bomb it. I have written a book on military technology. I am impressed by it, I use it. But the idea that the condition of war has changed so fundamentally that terrain, depth, don't matter, I don't accept. In the end, you have to go there and fight someone. And every war we have fought has shown the limits of technology, not its strength.
Interesting. Let me take these questions as a pair right here.
Thank you. Tomasz Szatkowski, National Center for Strategic Studies, Warsaw. My question is on NATO. The reaction to the Ukraine crisis, I think, have exposed once again the divergence of security interests within the European part of the NATO. And my question is whether we should still pretend that NATO is a unified organism, or should we follow an advice of some analysts which suggest that we should allow the alliance to actually operationalize and control those rifts and allow it to act on a basis of clusters of nations. Do you think that is a good idea?
Dr. Friedman, let me pick up Andrew real quickly as well, just a couple of these given our time.
Okay, Andrew Mikta, SIPA in Washington. George, I want to do two things because we've focused on the region. We're in Slovakia, we're talking about Central Europe. But one large part of this story is the United States. And I remember at the very beginning of the Obama administration, a very senior official announcing at CNAS in public, quote, "We do not need to engage Europe strategically anymore," unquote. And then the whole theory of engagement strategy and how we needed to build partnerships with difficult nations and whatnot followed. So my question to on this is, to what extent, having already established, I believe, that Mr. Putin has forced re-Europeanization of American optics to some extent. We don't know how far it's going to go, but we are rediscovering that we can't walk away from Eurasia. Stability of Eurasia matters. To what extent do you think this will translate into different policies, or at least a different type of conversation back home in this administration, and if you would like to stick your neck out a bit, for the incoming administration, Democrat or Republican? And the second point I want to ask is a question that to me, is something that once again is not being debated in my view. That is, if you look at the consequences of NATO enlargement and EU enlargement, and if you draw these parallels that so many publicists do, talking about the Cold War analogies, which I think are flawed, but in terms of where the threat is, I'm wrapping it up, one thing. Then this region is now the front line. This is the northeastern flank of the alliance. And therefore, in some way, Poland, the Baltics, and the V4 are becoming what Germany and other countries in the NATO alliance used to be. Shouldn't we start talking about who the anchor country should be, how the structure ought to be built, instead of constantly talking about will the West, which quite frankly in Western Europe cares less and less about these kinds of security concerns, come to the defense of the region, but rather how we should reinvest in Central and Eastern Europe?
Well, first, I think you've asked us, in a way, the same questions. And that question is, what is the status of NATO to begin with? And I would say it's a wonderful place to have cocktail parties in Brussels. As a military alliance, it no longer exists for two reasons. First, there is no common understanding among the NATO powers. Spain is not about to rush to defense of the Baltics. And plus, there is no weaponry. You've asked the question of the American, and I will turn it around a little bit. It is the one that we have not mentioned, Germany. Germany is the largest economic power. It is one of the weakest. What is its contribution? What is its position? Is it a neutral body to the rear? Is it the true engine of European defense? Is it a Russian ally? I pose three possible questions because I don't know that answer. That is far more mysterious than Washington, because the fact that incoherent statements are made in Washington, that's what we do in Washington. That's why we have it. Washington has no European ally to work with. The real answer to the United States at this point is there is a sea change going on in the United States, in both parties, on the question of engagement. But who do we engage with? NATO is a meaningless abstraction from a different era. The Germans, who we should be having constant dialogue with, will not, really don't want to discuss about this. They want to go somewhere else. I think the question here is not how the Americans respond, but what structure will be built here. And this structure will be built here and not by the Americans for the region and not anything else. I think the conversation that has to be had is the Polish-German conversation. And it has to be very clearly determined what their position is. I'm afraid I know it. And then what to do after that. But the United States cannot have a meaningful European policy unless there's a meaningful Europe. And so there are decisions to be made here among the Visegrad and others of how you wish to organize yourselves. And I know you'd rather ask the question, how do you want me to organize myself? But I don't really care, that's your problem. So the answer here to the American question is, I think, the one we've not talked about, I've not heard discussed, that I think is critical to this, is Germany. It has taken the leading place in Europe. What is its plans? And until we know what Germany's plans are, having a strategy is going to be very difficult.
So we have hit the witching hour. I have a lot of questions left out in the audience, which means you're going to have a lot of questions over coffee. I want to close with, our next panel is here, so I want to be respectful of them as well. But I want to close with your worldview. You see from the reaction of the questions here that a lot of people are challenging some of the assumptions. Mm-hmm. How has your worldview been shaped? You were born in Hungary, of a family of Holocaust survivors that fled communism, a mother that was born here in Bratislava. You made your life in the United States. What has shaped your worldview for these, to inform these forecasts, this analysis that you've laid out here and in your writing extensively?
That's a good question. In 1956, October, my sister got married on a Saturday night. We went home after the wedding and saw pictures of Budapest under attack. It was the same night of 56. The Russian tanks had come in. And believe it or not, they saw on television, we have television, Akacfőutca, a street in Budapest where they had lived. My father says, it never ends, does it? And that's where I got it from. For my father, he miscalculated about Hitler and Horthy. He then thought that Stalin didn't mean it. He then thought that his family was safe in Budapest and he didn't have to worry. And from that I learned something, that the very worst thing you can imagine frequently does happen. And that wishful thinking is not permitted serious people. And all of my writing, if you want, it turns around that. Now, this means that I am not good company. My children do not bring their friends to visit. But it also means that by imagining the worst, I have a remarkable track record. It's like I'm a genius. I'm no genius. If anything can go wrong in this world, particularly in this part of the world, it will go wrong. And we have no right as human beings to imagine otherwise. And the reason I have no patience for the European Union is they imagined otherwise. And now they're paying the price. Thank you.
So, Dr. Friedman. I think Dr. Friedman has been great company for this group, great conversation. We're going to turn over to what I hope will provide the antidote for that gloomy ending by turning and talking about Western leadership.